Well, a bit on the heavy side, obviously, for any kind of kitchen use. The Cold Steel Heavy Machete is actually nice in terms of general design and a number of principles for various use. And the first one is the blade is so wide and is so down in relationship to the handle that it's very easy to work on a cutting board. Now, the main problem is that the cutting ability is rather low compared to a normal blade that you would use in the kitchen, and that's simply because the standard bevel that they come with is very short, and thus the angle is relatively high, and then you hit full flat stock. So if you take that compared to a normal kitchen knife, it's night and day. You try to do that with the heavy machete, and you can see the cuts as well, very clean and smooth, where there's fracturing with the Cold Steel Heavy Machete, because again it's causing the potatoes to split. But if you're just talking about utility work and not actually preparing food for on a line or something like that, you're in the kitchen. With a couple of modifications, as I've noted before, I fully rounded out and enlarged the choil area to get 2 fingers in there. It is decently functional, and it's in fact a lot more comfortable than some other knives which can be a bit awkward. One common one is of course a Cold Steel Trailmaster or similar. And one of the issues with the Cold Steel Trailmaster is the guard and the forcing to work up much higher, so your wrist is in a much higher position. So in comparison, when I'm using the Cold Steel Heavy Machete, my wrist is much more relaxed. And even though I'm using more force, it's actually more comfortable in the long run to use the machete in a much more relaxed wrist position. Not that I'd ever go to use that in the kitchen over an extended period of time, but just for short work, it's kind of interesting to note the difference because you can feel it right away. But the other thing that you'll notice is that the effect that the full grind makes, and you can see that the MT151 is far thicker than the Cold Steel Heavy Machete, but it cuts much smoother, and that's simply because the full height grind reduces the edge thickness, so down in this area, which is the only part that's cutting, it's still functionally a lot thinner than the Cold Steel Heavy Machete. Now of course there's no reason that you can't put the same sort of primary grind on this machete, and I'm likely going to do that later on. I mean, there's no benefit to just going with a single grind here on this. You want a primary grind of around 3 to 5 degrees, and then leave the edge somewhere in thickness, depending on skill level and a bunch of other things, between say 15 thousandths and 35 thousandths. Up above 35 thousandths you're really leaving it optimized for durability, working and smashing through really hard knots, and at about 15 you're optimizing it for cutting ability and ease of sharpening. And I'll note later on, after I do that edge regrind, the difference in performance you will get. And of course the main thing that you would be using these machetes for isn't precision work such as I've been doing here, but it would be mainly like that, where you're chopping through heavier vegetables, just getting some stuff cleaved up. And you can see it does this of course very well because it has the weight and power, and there's no slipping. You do this all day long, just little pop pop pops. So I've actually been fooling around with it in the kitchen. The only main concern or drawback that I have right now, again, is because it has this very wedge grind, because it only has a single bevel on it. So I'm going to need to run a primary grind on this obviously and get the cutting ability up. work with a cold steel heavy machete, trying to get a grasp on the handle because it just wasn't feeling very good to me. I wasn't getting the precision that I normally would get. It felt uncomfortable. Lots of raw power, of course, on the blade. So it easily annihilates a small piece of wood with all the usual problems of having just a single bevel. Again, you don't get that smooth cut into the wood. It's more of an abrupt hammer type feel, and you can see a lot of fracturing because it goes, of course, from bevel to flat stock almost immediately. But the main problem I was having was with the handle. So I started doing some side-by-side work with the heavy machete and this custom from Andrew Takach, which has a really nice feeling handle. Secure, comfortable. As I've noted before, I made a slight modification where I sort of rounded the edges a bit. That's all, relatively minor. And the penetration, comfort, everything, stability is much higher with this handle. So I was trying to figure out exactly what the difference was. So I was doing some work and just paying really close attention to my hand and how it felt, and I figured it out. And it's rather obvious now that once I figured it out. When I'm using Andrew's blade, or most blades, the grip is very tight between the thumb and the index finger, and that's where most of the power comes from. The snap is around this point, so that's the point that it's rotating, right about right here where I have my index finger and thumb. And on the end of the cut, that's where I'm driving into. So I'm pushing the blade, and the blade is being pushed along a line that runs right down here and runs right out through my thumb and index finger. Straight push, straight through my hand. So now, just cut up some flooring. Very easy. Very natural. Good power. Great control. Comfort. Now, of course, this is not hard to cut by any means. But swap out to the cold steel heavy machete. Now you can see lots of power. And on this wood, bit of variance in the wood you can see from piece to piece. Some of this is a bit wider than others. This is a piece similar to what I was cutting with Andrew's blade. Problem is, this feels horrible in hand in comparison to Andrew's knife, which I can work with all day long, very comfortable. Here's the difference. When you make a grip with your hand, normally, you can see that your middle finger and ring finger, I'm exaggerating it here, but are further up from your index finger and your pinky. On the cold steel heavy machete, it's the exact opposite. When you make a tight grip, as you can see here, your middle finger and ring finger are in closer than your index finger and your pinky. So that's not the natural way you want to grip, and it's not the natural way that you will grip on a normal handle. So you can see here again, my index finger makes a much tighter grip than my middle finger and ring finger. So it feels more natural, but it also allows me to get that drive, again, because I'm driving with a line that runs straight down here and into my index finger and thumb. So the problem is, when I grip like this, my index finger and thumb feel like they're being pushed apart. Because naturally my thumb and index finger, again, want to be a lot tighter, a lot closer than my middle finger and ring finger are. So when they're in like this, wrapped around this very narrow section, it feels like my index finger and thumb are being pushed apart. And that to me gives a relatively high rate of fatigue and makes it uncomfortable. But once I realized that, it was relatively easy to adjust the way that I was cutting. So again, normally I cut with a relatively tight grip up front around my index finger and thumb. The rest of my fingers are relatively loose, especially my middle finger and ring finger. And I perform a snap where I drive with a line coming down here, pressing the blade into the wood, and I torque back with my pinky. This doesn't work very well on this grip, because again, my index finger and thumb are being splayed out, and so is my pinky. So what I have to do is shift my grip so that my grip is centered on these two fingers, my middle finger and my ring finger, and what I do is I move my thumb down. So normally my thumb is up very high. As you can see, it's even up on top of my index finger because I'm driving along this line. So in comparison, on the cold Steel Heavy Machete, I'm gripping through here. Here's the line of force, my middle finger and ring finger. So what I'm doing is I'm moving my thumb down a bit. So what that does is I drive closer through my thumb towards my middle finger, and I make it more of a straight push again instead of a snap, because of course you can snap or rotate very easily around the top of your hand. You can't snap and rotate very easily towards the center of your hand. So to make the cold steel machete more functional, lower rate of fatigue, lower comfort, again I'm gripping with a rather tight grip with most of the focus running through the center of my hand, and I'm leaving my index finger and pinky relatively loose, shifting my thumb down towards them and doing more of a straight push instead of a rotation. Now you won't see it on camera maybe directly, back in your pouch buddy, but it makes a big difference in how it feels in hand, because again I'm concentrating on my middle finger and index finger so I'm getting rid of that awkwardness that I was feeling when comparing it to the other blades. And the reason all this came about is because I was discussing this with Chris Anders, who likes this style of handle, and he's a relatively straightforward guy, so I figured there must be something I'm missing. If he's really liking that grip and I found it completely useless, everybody basically has the same hand shape, so I figured it must be just the way I'm holding it. So now, again, difference in grip. So I still not 100% set on this grip, and up until now I'm used to moving and chopping with a different grip. But like I said, with those slight few alterations, making a tighter grip and working from the center of my hand, it doesn't feel awkward now. Precision is starting to come together, power is starting to come together, and the interesting thing, as I've said before, the nice thing about working with different grips is I can easily go out with one day, I can work with this knife, I can easily go out the next day and work with Andrew's, and the fatigue doesn't exactly overlap each other. Because again, with Andrew's, I'm doing much more of the heavy snap rotation centered on my thumb and index finger and pinky. Whereas, let go, on the cold steel heavy machete, I'm gripping again with my middle finger and ring finger and shifting my thumb down. Very different grip in hand, relatively fatigues different parts of the hand, so it's kind of interesting. Take me a while to work with this to get a feel to see which one I prefer, But again, it's a lot more functional now after talking to Chris and doing some modifications to my grip than I thought originally. And again, of course, I've also modified this. I've roughened up the handle, I've enlarged the choil area, rounded this off, rounded the spine, sharpened the edge, lowered it a few degrees. Even with these things though, it still has too much of a blunt force trauma type effect, because it again only has this very short single bevel. So as I talked about before, when I put the primary grind on this, I'm going to end up with a transition bevel. So I'll put a primary grind of probably around 2.5 DPS. I'll bring that down probably around 25 thou, and then from 25 thou down to around say 10 or 15 thou, that will be my actual transition bevel. And the last or finally apex bevel will be around I would say 10 DPS. So I'll get that modification done probably later on this evening. And again, everything is starting to come together on this machete now. The edge now can take a decent sharpness. It'll easily slice newsprint with just a little tiny bit of work, so most of the burnt metal has gone off it. And I've got a handle on the handle, so I'll put the time now into putting a decent primary grind on this. So I'll have a primary grind, transition bevel, and then final apex bevel.